That'll be it. It's okay. We'll have fun. Brett,
Sir,
how would somebody out of state get into this class?
they would just have to go to our YouTube, River Valley Church of Christ on YouTube.
Okay,
It should appear right there at the top.
good, okay.
All right, just started a 5-minute
You what?
countdown. We just started a 5-minute countdown timer.
Okay.
So basically 7 o'clock, you're good to go.
Okay. Hey, there's Sean.
Hi there. How are you doing? Good. How are you?
Good. Oh, I didn't realize you were downsizing. So how's Tommy doing?
Pretty good.
Good. Well, I know she was here Sunday.
She's been coming to church, but she doesn't get out at night really.
Well, I don't blame her.
I mean, I offered to pick her up, but
Uh-huh.
she's just, ready for bed a lot earlier these days.
Hello, Dave. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Got ready to go and I couldn't find my keys.
Oh, no.
So I was running all over the house trying to find them, and then I finally went in my bedroom because I had had them in this coat pocket, and they were on the floor.
Of course they were.
I'm like, "What are
I
you,
have
nuts?"
looked everywhere and they've been in the passenger seat of my car.
Oh,
I'm
that's
thinking,
scary,
What?
especially if you're out somewhere.
Yeah, but how did they get there?
Who knows? Rodney used to steal mine when he was little. He'd steal them and he'd put them in his toy trucks, Tonka trucks and stuff.
No.
And so I finally got this, it's about the size of a small ruler, and I put it on there on the key, and that way I could see it.
Oh, great.
Kids.
They're just magicians.
Ornery.
They're just magicians.
I guess we could, it's the same role. better with your back and all that stuff?
Back is good, I now have diabetes. If it isn't one thing, it's 7. I
Well,
just
see,
got-
I'm a borderline diabetic.
No, I got diagnosed
Actually, the whole,
for 3 weeks ago. So,
I'm
working
sorry.
on different meds, shoot myself in the gut with something.
oh, you actually have to use the shot?
Well, it's called Trulicity. You've probably heard of that.
I've heard of it on
television.
TV.
Yeah, and that keeps my sugar numbers down, because I went in and when the blood work was done, my sugar number was 12.
Oh, no.
And today it was 8. So you know that junk works.
I guess so.
So,
Don's mother used to have to take injections.
did she? She took insulin.
Yep.
Oh, no, I'm taking something, well, the Trulicity, but then the oral, which they want me to start on, is called metformin. And I said, that makes me sicker than it goes.
Oh, then you,
And I said, you can set your watch by it. I take it for 20 minutes.
We'll sit down
20
front.
minutes later,
Show up late, sit down
I've got
front.
diarrhea
Sit down
and
within
throwing up.
spitting
I'm
distance.
not taking that anymore, by the way.
it must be a reaction.
Yeah, and today they said, we really want you to try to work on this metformin. I said, no,
I can't.
And they said, no, it's a different strain, you know.
Okay,
I said, I'm gonna try it.
we about got it?
Believe me.
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, me too.
But at least they have, well, they have the courage, so.
Yeah. No, I was sick, I didn't know.
Well, good to see everyone this evening. If you will turn to Luke, the 7th chapter.
Dave, is your mic on?
No.
Probably not,
I could hear you.
more than likely. Okay. If you turn to Luke 7 and note verses 1 through 10. Even though it just shows a few verses on the screen, we're going to start out before we get into the Old Testament study, and we're going to note a number of points from the major prophets. Donnie just took care of the minor prophets and his series of lessons, and we're going to go into the major prophets and just note a few points. When you have the major prophets, of course, you got a lot of material to work with. So we're going to see some points that perhaps you haven't looked at. For instance, we'll get into Isaiah 6, which is a throne room scene, and we'll cover the throne room scenes that we find within the major prophets. We find a great throne room scene in the Revelation, and even though the Revelation is written in a grammatical style that was very popular with the Jews, it still is not the Old Testament. So we'll not note that. We may refer back to it. But we'll look at the throne room scenes, and then we'll look at some scripture that really has good application. There's no use studying the Old Testament or even the New Testament if you don't make a present-day application. Was it written directly to us? No. When you're looking at the New Testament, for instance, and you're looking at the book of Romans, it was written to the brethren, the church that was in Rome. And it was not written to us. Is there any application that we can find in the book of Romans? Oh, lots of application. So it has what we call real good didactic value. And that didactic value means that it has a great teaching value. So when we're looking at the book of Isaiah, that is a very early major prophet, and the prophets don't start appearing in written form until the people have just really almost gone over the edge, and they're about to go off into both either Assyrian captivity or Babylonian captivity. and we look at the prophets and God sending the prophets, probably sent more prophets than what we find in the written prophets of the minor prophets or the major prophets. But when we look at a prophet like Isaiah, Isaiah writes at a very early time, but most of all that writing, or a lot of that writing, appears around the time of King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah gives birth to a child by the name of Manasseh, who is the most apostate king in all of Judah. And from there on, from there until the Babylonian captivity, they're in a downward spiral. I think we can look at a lot of the material that we find in the major prophets and the minor prophets, but in the major prophets as having a great deal of application for us today. And we ask ourselves, as we look out into our world and our country, are we in a spiral? Are we in a downward spiral? I certainly hope not. We've had rough times in this country before, and we'll probably have rough times in days to come. But we'll survive just like the brethren survived. So as we look at, beginning with this section, I'm going to just talk about historical, cultural context. Now, the reason why we need to know historical, cultural context is because we're not living back then. And by the way, if we were to go back there and try to live in some sort of time machine, we'd have all sorts of difficulty. In 1633, when settlers first came into this country, they almost immediately started infecting all of the indigenous people, or the people who had moved here, the Native American people, and scores of those people, beginning with the Seneca Nation up in upstate New York, started dying off. And from very not unusual diseases, according to the Europeans, but smallpox was an absolute killer. And it would just wipe out tribe after tribe after tribe. And we would do the same thing if we were in a time machine. We've got immunity built up to certain diseases. Wherever you move in this world, not necessarily across the United States, but we lived in New Zealand for 6 years, and we found out there was a new set of germs. There were germs that were different than the germs here in this country. And so we all ended up not having terrible diseases because they knew how to handle those, but we had just an immunity system problem in moving to just a new geographic area. And so if we were to go back in time, we would have a problem taking disease with us. They would have a problem because they would not have an immune system that could take care of those diseases. And so we'd do pretty much the same thing to everyone before us as the first settlers in 1633 did, moving into the New England area. And you can see how that wouldn't work. I mean, what if you killed off the ones who were your ancestors? Then you wouldn't appear, you wouldn't be around. So that's not going to work. But sometimes we say, I'd really like to go back and I'd really like to see what it was like. Well, we've got a pretty good idea as to what it was really like. We've got lots of historical information, and I'm going to share some of that with you to begin this course in the historical, cultural context. What was it like back then? What were the people like back then? We can get a little bit of a hint from Scripture, and certainly we can get more than a hint when we're looking at what does God expect individuals. Well, He expects certain things. He expects a heart that is inclined toward Him, and He wants to be the one who is served. He's the one who wants to be referred to as Lord. And so we're going to look at Luke 7, verses 1 through 10 real quick, because this is a great historical, cultural, contextual situation. And I'll show you how it's a situation here as we go through it. In chapter 7, verse 1, when he had completed all his discourse, this is Jesus the Christ, in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum. And a certain centurion slave who was highly regarded by him was sick, highly regarded by the centurion, was sick and about to die. And when he heard about Jesus, he, that would be the centurion, sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of his slave. Now, there's a big cultural problem just happened right there in that verse. And you may not have picked it up, but a centurion is a Gentile. He's a Roman legionary, not legionnaire, that's French Foreign Legion. We don't call them legionnaires, we call them legionaries. He's a legionary who has worked his way up from the number 10 cohort all the way up maybe to the number 1 cohort. And if he's the number 1 centurion in the number 1 cohort, they're the first to go into battle. They're the most experienced. Then he's called the primus pilus. He's just the number 1 man. He's equivalent to what ranking we would find in the U.S. Army as a U.S. major. And he really did guide the legion and the tribunes and the legates, who were the generals, the officer ranks, the more privileged, the wealthier individuals. They really counted on the primus pilus to say, when they were going someplace, well, which way should we go? Should we go to the left? We should go to the right. And he would tell them, and they would do it, and they'd be okay. He's the one who had the experience. So he is the one, it is his servant, and Jesus is being approached, and he's using some Jewish elders. Now, you perhaps don't see the problem right there, but Jew and Gentile just didn't mix from either direction. They just really didn't get along. Now, they got along all right business-wise, and if there was money to be made, that was all right. But in any other way, they just did not get along together. And it wasn't so much the Gentiles' fault as it was the Jewish fault. But the Jews, because of the immorality of the Gentiles of the time, and that just seeps over into the New Testament, where we've got a Jewish, Gentile, Christian problem. When Gentiles are becoming members of the church, the Jewish Christians have a problem with that because of the morality problem. And so we see that there. But here we have a centurion, a Roman legionary, a Roman officer ranking, who has somehow come in contact with the elders of this community, and he has done something. And when they had come to Jesus, verse 4, they earnestly entreated him, saying, he is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation. I don't know, not many Roman legionaries, when they were to go to a legion that was within the promised land, were all that thrilled. They knew they weren't going to be able to get along with the people all that well. They'd already made a pact with the people that they would never bring their eagles, that would be their standards for the legions, into the city of Jerusalem. They were generally quartered in the Antonia Fortress area, which had been built by the Greeks at a much earlier time, and that's where they were quartered. But the Decimus, Legio Decimus Frontensis, was one of the primary legions in the Jerusalem area during the time when Jesus was crucified, the 10th Legion. And they just were not all that well liked. And yet, here's a centurion who has really found a connection with the people, and the elders have come. The elders have come. The centurion didn't come. He loves our nation. It was he who built us our synagogue. That's just absolutely astounding. Now Jesus started on his way with them, verse 6, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. Now here's a centurion who has made his way through the ranks by many times fisticuffs, and he's worked his way up at least to a centurion, even if he is the lowliest centurion in the 10th cohort. He's still a centurion, and yet he says, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. And He says in verse 8, "For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." And when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the multitude that was following him, a Jewish crowd, by the way, "I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith." And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. So there is a crossing a cultural boundary right there. And it's such a beautiful one, because it's something that I talk to about individuals who are going to do foreign mission work, and that is, if you don't love the nation you're going to, don't go. Really, don't go. We had a couple in school a number of years ago, and they told me, said, "We're going to go to Scotland. We'd like to go to Scotland." And so we had come back from New Zealand, and New Zealand and Scotland are not the same, but I knew what Scotland was like. And I said, "Are you going to take a survey trip?" "Yes, we're going to take a survey trip." Well, I said, "Go in the winter. Don't go in the summer. Go in the winter." Then they did. And they came back and they said, "Scotland's not for us." Well, that was a good time to find that out. But when you're dealing with Scotland, or you're dealing with Europe, you're dealing with Germany, that area in the wintertime is the way they heat or do not heat their houses, and it is cold. It's a bone-chilling cold. And so if you're not going to make it through the winter, then perhaps you better not go. Summer might be nice, beautiful country, but to not go. And so in verse 5, when it says, when they say to Jesus, these are elders, and they're pleading for Jesus to help a Gentile. They're elders. They're of position within the community, for he loves our nation. And so that's a good point for us to note, and especially if we're sending people off into the mission field. Okay. This slide that we have right here is a synagogue at Capernaum. This is a reconstruction of the synagogue that was on this spot in 3 AD. So this would not be the same synagogue that Jesus is going to be noted here in Luke, in this section of Luke, where Jesus goes to preach. However, this synagogue in 3 AD is built upon the foundation of the synagogue that was in place when Jesus preached in Capernaum. So as we're trying to get a feel for what things were like, we could look at this particular synagogue and say, probably what we're looking at right here in the synagogue, and here's an artist's rendition of what it would look like. As we're looking at this, we would say that and that's from an overhead view of what it would look like, and giving you the dimensions and what archaeological evidence they have right now concerning it. This is what it would have looked like. Well, this is what it would have looked like, but that still doesn't give us too much of a feel for what things were like at that time. This is a painting, an artist's rendition of a Roman legion, probably 2 Roman legions crossing a bridge. Now, they always carried an engineering unit with them, and the engineers here have built a bridge. It's a quick, fast bridge. During World War II, the British had a real neat invention, the British Army, called the Bailey Bridge. I know a little bit about Bailey bridges, because a lot of the bridges in New Zealand, when we were there in 69 to 75, there were a lot of Bailey bridges, and so they had just used those old Army Bailey bridges and made them highway bridges. There were one-way bridges in New Zealand, so you'd stop at one end, make sure there was nobody on the bridge, and then you'd go across, or you might have a traffic light that would let you know when you could go across. And some of the bridges in New Zealand you'd share with trains, and so you make sure that there were no trains coming down the tracks. But the Bailey Bridge, but this is, and that was an all steel bridge. This is all wood, and you'll note that it's set on boats that are anchored in the water. And if you'll note the stern of the boat right there, if you can see it if it's clear enough, you can see a board going down into the water. That's called a steer board. That's before rudders were invented. See, things are a little bit different. Rudders are a more recent invention. And that's called a steer board. Usually we find two steer boards, one on the left side and one on the right side, with a connection, and the helmsman stood on the deck back there, and he moved that steer board back and forth, and that's what would guide the ship. And the steer board would then become the term, when you left port, it would be called port. That's the port side of a ship. And if you are going toward, then that's on the right side, that's called starboard. That's from steerboard. And so all of these legionaries are crossing the bridge, and this is what they would have looked like. They're carrying most of their armor. They're carrying the helmets. They're carrying packs with about 60 pounds in it, and you can see right there in the center, it's hard to see, but you can see the one individual who is called an aquilopher is carrying the eagles. That's where Aquila gets his name. Aquila, Priscilla and Aquila. Aquila means eagle, and it comes from the Latin for the eagle, or the aquilopher in this particular case. This is what a Roman legionary looks like in full battle uniform, first century. And I have a guy in my office who looks just like this, who's all dressed in this armor. And so if you're ever down by the offices sometime and you walk by and my door is open, don't jump. In fact, when I had got him all dressed up and put him in my office, it's a mannequin. Every once in a while when I go in the morning, early morning, I just didn't think about it. He'd be standing there and I'd just jump. But it took me about a week or two to get over just jumping every time I saw him in the office. But he is fully equipped in the office. He has the shield, the scutum. He has one pila. That's the throwing javelin right there. He's wearing a gladius on his left hip. He's wearing a pugio on his right hip, a dagger. He's dressed in caligula. Those are the sandals. And he doesn't have the big hobnailed sandals that the combative legionary would wear. He's wearing segmenta, lorica. That would be the armor that he's wearing. It's a Corbridge style helmet, and he's pretty well outfitted. So it would be not much of a move from there up to, and here he is putting on his armor, and quite a process that he was going through. And he would be not much different in looking as you come to the centurion. This is a legion. This is the first cohort right here on the left-hand side. And this cohort is an overstrength cohort. And the cohorts usually would be 1,000 men at full strength. Usually they were about 600 men. Legions were generally found around 6,000, 10 cohorts, and 600 men or 1,000 men in each cohort, but it was never 1,000 men. But this is an overstrength cohort. They're probably going into battle, and they want a strong, most experienced. And so as you move down the legion, and it only shows 6 cohorts right there, or a part of 6 cohort up in the upper right-hand corner, the legion would march into battle, and they would go in by sentries within the cohort. And so there's 10 sentries to a cohort, 10 cohorts to a legion. A legion would be about 6,000 men. So the centurion of Luke is from one of these legions. We have no idea who he's from. Even when we get to Cornelius, we get some indication as to the legion that he is a part of, but we don't know for sure. All centurions that are found within the New Testament are very highly spoken of. Very highly. And these are guys that made their living in knowing how to disable and kill individuals in combat. A real tough people at the time. You had to be 5'10" to be a legionary. And the problem is that the average height of people during that time, and we're talking about first century, would be somewhere around 5'3". And we know that from archaeological digs where we can see the doorways and how high the doorways are. And so we know. Even Julius Caesar, I found out the other day, Julius Caesar was only 5'8". But he was a general, so it didn't matter how tall he was. He still could lead a legion, and of course he did. He became a dictator as a result of his influence. But that's the way a legion would be arrayed. And this would be a legion on parade, and we know he's on parade because the centurion who's right there in the front has the horsehair crest, runs from side to side, not from front to back. But that's only for parade, that's only for display. Never go into battle with that. And he's wearing greaves on his legs, those metal pieces that protect the front part of his legs. Never go into battle with greaves. And you'll note that all ancient soldiers wore skirts. They didn't wear pants, they didn't wear trousers. In fact, Roman legionaries, when they had to do duty in Scotland up around Hadrian's Wall, they took for themselves pants made out of animal skin, but they didn't like pants because pants to the Roman legionary, they were too feminine. Too feminine. So anyway, there's you can see the standard, the eagle that's being carried right there in the center, and then things that note what that particular legion is. So we come down to looking at two legionaries. There, one sitting, the other's talking, and one is saying to the other, "He's right behind you." And that's a centurion in parade dress uniform right behind him. And he's carrying a stick. And he doesn't use the stick because he needs it as a crutch. He carries a stick because that's what he does to get everybody in line. He whacks them across the head. And so these guys were pretty rough and tough. And it's just amazing every time we find them in the New Testament. They're so highly, highly spoken of. And this is a first century Roman centurion in parade dress uniform. And he wears his gladius on the left side rather than the right side. That's one way we can tell the difference. And when he's in parade dress uniform, his horsehair crest runs from side to side. And he has those little things on the front of his garment. Those are medals. Those are medals. And that's the way he would look. So we come to our worldview. And what I want to get across this evening is that you have a worldview, and I have a worldview. And our worldview is not probably exactly the same. I grew up in upstate New York, a place called Binghamton, New York. And I married a girl from Amarillo, Texas. Well, I really crossed the cultural boundary, didn't I? And when I was looking at my assignment from the Air Force, it said Amarillo, Texas. And I thought, whoa, I got a pretty good idea where Texas is, but I sure don't know where Amarillo is. And so when those of us who were going to Amarillo flew in, we flew in March. And this was March of 1955. In March of 1955, there was a sandstorm blowing. Hey, imagine that. Amarillo, Texas, sand blowing. There was sand blowing. We were dressed in blues. There was a sandstorm blowing, and then the temperature dropped, and it turned to rain, and then it turned to sleet, and our blue uniforms turned brown. Now, there's a little bit of a culture shock right there, right away. But I didn't say I want to go home. I was a little bit more adventuresome than that. So I stayed around. It's a good thing I did, because that's why I met Barbara Ann, and of course, she became my wife. So there is a worldview that each of us has, and I don't know if you can read this or not, but I'll read it to you. And this is a great statement concerning a worldview. And your worldview is determined by where you grew up and who you grew up with and what sort of society you were in, what type of schooling you went to. And so for some people, their worldview is very limited because they never leave the area that they've grown up in. And in earlier times, when there was very little communication outside of your own area, you just didn't know what was going on in the world. So if you're going back to the first century, you're not talking about a newspaper every morning. That's not going to happen. You're not talking about turning on the radio and hear, oh, radio? What's a radio? Wait a minute. Here I'm talking about some things to a group. Well, you're not that young. But no television. What sort of communication? Word of mouth. Camel caravans coming through. Camel caravans were generally grilled. What's happening? What do you hear out in the world? What's happening over in Egypt? Have you come in from Egypt? Where have you come from? And there was a means of communication, but nothing instant, no instant communication. And so even in early days of this country, in the colonial days, there wouldn't be that much communication. In the New England area, towns were designed to be within 20 miles of one another, so that one who would normally walk some 3 to 4 miles an hour would be able to make the journey to a town that was close by. But then as time went on, towns became further apart, but communication became better. But anyway, let's take a look at the worldview right here. The basic way of interpreting things and events that pervades a culture so thoroughly that it becomes a culture's concept of reality. What is good? What is important? What is sacred? What is real? Worldview is more than culture. Even though the distinction between the two can sometimes be subtle, it extends to perceptions of time and space, of happiness and well-being. The beliefs, values, and behaviors of a culture stem directly from its worldview. That was written by an individual by the name of Carol A. Hill. So I'm going to come down and give us a sort of a test right here. And I'm going to ask the question, what's wrong with this painting? It's a very well-known painting. And as we look at it, this is a painting that most everybody recognizes. It is a painting of Jesus by George Hincke. And George Hincke lived from 1883 to 1953. The thing about George Hincke is that he's a more recent artist, and yet we recognize this and we say, well, that's a portrait of Jesus. But is there anything wrong with it? I'll show you in a moment what's wrong with it from what we have figured out and looking at our historical context and our cultural context of a long time ago. Interestingly enough, George Hincke was best known for his paintings of Santa Claus with Coca-Cola. And yet, everybody, just nearly everybody, recognizes this particular painting. Now, as we're looking at forensic scientists, and here's a forensic scientist right here, and he's working with a first century skull. He was given a number of first century skulls, and he will build the skull up, and this is used for police situations where they just find the skeletal remains and then they build a face on the skull. He's going to put a face on this particular skull, and this is what he came up with. And what he came up with is something that is quite Mediterranean. Now, I'm not saying that this is what Jesus looked like, but the dark hair, the curly hair, the shorter hair, the distinct nose, the eyes, the coloration of the skin is very Mediterranean. And we know it's Mediterranean because we have some Greek paintings. And this is a painting from that particular time frame of a Greek. Now, you're not going to find any Jewish paintings of individuals. You'll not find any pictures hanging on the wall. That's not going to work. And you'll not find any sculpture. The Jewish individuals, the Israelites, were very concrete in their thought, not abstract like the Greeks. They were very event-oriented. The Greeks were very time-oriented. And when I say Greeks, I'm lumping the Romans in. Well, the Romans are the big copycats of the Greeks, and so just sort of them all together, and I've already been talking about the Romans. But here we have a painting that is of the particular time, and you can see the hair right there. And here's another one of that particular time, the shorter hair. Now, did the Jewish males ever wear their hair long? Yes, when they took a Nazirite vow. Because remember in the Nazirite vow, when you're talking about Samson, a Nazirite cannot cut their hair once they take the vow. Now, in the Nazirite vow, it can be a man or a woman. They can take the vow, but they can't cut their hair. No razor will come to their hair. So they could have longer hair. But generally, the male did not wear long hair. We can even get into the Corinthian situation where we're talking about long hair and short hair, and we find long hair being a mark of a woman, but long hair not being a mark of a male. And so it seems rather strange that we have in our mindset, in our worldview, we have in our portrayal of Jesus, and we do give him an image every time we come to Jesus, anytime we come to anybody within Scripture, and this is a part of our visualization process, and it aids us in our reading if we can visualize all of this. The train came into the station. It was a steam locomotive. What was the noise that was being made as it came into the station? Now, for those of you who have not been around steam engines, but I have, because when I was growing up, we had a roundhouse in the neighborhood. We had steam engines all the time. And so I remember all of that. I was around during World War II when we lived out in the country and troop trains were coming by about every 15 minutes, just full bore, all packed full of all sorts of military goods. And being a kid, I just stand out there and watch all this stuff go by and go, ah. But here we have the looks of the time. And what we're going to look at right here is, this is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And I'm sorry that it's so far away for you, but it is a Renaissance painting that has really shaped our view in our mind of what Jesus looks like. Leonardo da Vinci was hindered by what was actually maybe happening in the Promised Land, the Palestine area, and he made the painting according to what he observed around him. I was in Fort Myers, Florida some time ago, and the Ringling Brothers, and I don't remember if it's Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, but there was a museum there in Fort Myers. And in the museum are a lot of Renaissance paintings. And the Renaissance paintings, of course, that was the age of enlightenment when we were getting back to the classical literature, which we probably shouldn't have gotten back to because it's all Greek philosophy. But the classical literature, and then we got back into the painting of the time and beautiful paintings that came forth. But as I was going down looking at those paintings in the museum in Fort Myers, I saw some Roman soldiers, and they were not Roman soldiers of the first century. Now, the Roman Empire was gone by 476. They were Roman soldiers of the Renaissance. They had crossbows. No crossbows in Roman equipment. It hasn't been invented yet. Hasn't been invented yet. And so if you ever saw the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, and you saw all of that, he gets up on a horse, and the horse has a saddle and stirrups. Maybe some form of a saddle, but no stirrups. Haven't been invented yet. And I'll bet you that horse had horseshoes. Horseshoes hadn't been invented yet. You see. So, but we get a worldview. We have a view that many times is foisted off on us by Hollywood. But here, this view is foisted off on us right here by Leonardo da Vinci himself. And Da Vinci presents us with this painting, and it is the Last Supper, and he tried to make it as accurate as possible. And in John 13 and verse 23, actually around John 13, we find this Last Supper. And the problem with this particular painting, and I'll just go ahead and note these things for you. This Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519. And we find Jesus talking. When Jesus said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." Now this is at the moment of the betrayal. It's what Da Vinci was trying to get. The disciples began looking at one another, at a loss to know of which one he was speaking. John 13, verses 21 and 22. So when we come back to this, and if you were able to get a little bit closer, the one who is immediately to Jesus' right is the Apostle John. The Apostle John, in virtually all Renaissance paintings, was painted as a woman. If you're able to get close to this, you'll see that there's a woman portrayed right there. Now, right next to John the Apostle is Peter, and hanging over his shoulder is Judas Iscariot. So they're all looking at one another saying, "Who is it? Who is it? Who is it?" But why would the Renaissance painters paint the Apostle John as a woman? Well, perhaps because of the love that was noted within Scripture between Jesus and it just didn't seem right to paint the Apostle John as a man, and yet it's wrong. It's not right. So, what's wrong with this painting? Well, first of all, it's a Passover meal, not a banquet. That's a banquet scene. That's not the Passover. That scene by Leonardo da Vinci is a linear table with chairs. Now, a linear table with chairs is found within society at this time, even earlier, but it's not that in Scripture, because in John 13, verse 23, it says they are reclining at table. When you recline at table, that's a triclinium. And a triclinium is a U-shaped table that's built real close to the floor with cushions around the outer side of it, and individuals leaning against those cushions and eating off the table, with individuals serving on the inside of a U. You're on the outside of the U, reclining at table, and they're serving on the inside. Works out really well. It's very Roman in design, but it was adopted by by the Jews, and it is, Scripture notes that it is a triclinium. So they're not reclining at table. That's wrong. The Passover is celebrated on a full moon. Daylight is seen through the window, if you remember. I'll go back to it in a moment and note that for you. Glasses and not cups for the wine. No, the cups would be terracotta. They'd be clay, oven-fired clay cups, not glass. With glass around, yes, if you're ever up in upstate New York and you're over in Corning, New York, go to the Steuben Glass Works. They have a fantastic glass museum there, and a part of their glass museum is Egyptian glass. And there are some Egyptian glass cups, but not so among the Israelites. Crusty loaves of bread leaves you with the idea it's leavened bread. No, it's unleavened bread that should be on the table. No lamb on the table? Wait a minute. That's what the Passover is all about. Fish is on this table. The clothing is all of Da Vinci's time. The clothing is not of first century time. Faces are Western European and not Jewish. There's not anyone in that group that is not closely related to an Anglo-Saxon background. They're all white people. They're not Mediterranean. Some faces lack facial hair. No. And someone has said that it's probably thought that the Jews of this particular time wore facial hair because the Romans, who were the oppressors within the land, didn't wear facial hair. They shaved on a regular basis. They didn't have facial hair. In fact, Julius Caesar shaved his whole body. He had so much hair on his body. You probably didn't want to know that. But here again we have it. You can see at the bottom, this is on a wall. It's on a wall in the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan, or Milano. And it is not a fresco, it's a dry wall panel painting. And it's a beautiful painting. But you can see that people of Da Vinci's time or shortly thereafter didn't think all that much of it. You see right there in the middle where the feet are cut off, somebody decided to cut a doorway in that wall. And so they just hacked away at the painting till they made a doorway right there. But you can see that it's not Passover time, it's not at night, it's in the daytime. And it is, and the one portraying Jesus right here has long hair. And so from that point on, you're going to find those renditions of Jesus having long hair. Let's just look at some other aspects of the time just to sort of put you in the mood, trying to get you out of your bedroom slippers into your sandals. Bedroom slippers would not have been known at that time, but sandals would. And so looking at a 4-room house for a family in the tribe of Reuben, this takes you way back. The tribe of Reuben and Umari, that's south of Amman, Jordan. It was discovered in 1976 and is found in Joshua 13, verses 8 through 10, and we're looking at a time frame for all of this. And this is what the single-family dwelling house would look like. This particular one is built against a wall. This is what it would have looked like when it was fully constructed. It's an archaeological dig today, and I'll show you the archaeological dig that goes around with it. We're dealing with people who are either pastoral or agricultural. We're not looking at industrial age. Industrial age comes much later. Industrial age is determined by metallurgy, and metallurgy has not come anywhere past bronze and iron, and it stays that way for hundreds of years, bronze and iron. And then finally, during the Roman period, a little bit before the Roman period, carbon steel is developed, and steel is the weapon of choice from that time on. But still, when we're looking at agricultural people or pastoral people, this is the way Daddy did it, this is the way his daddy did it, this is the way his daddy did it, and that's carried down in every aspect of life. In the plow that you use, and the way the plow is designed, and the pruning hooks, and all of the, not necessarily the weapons, but we talk about turning plowshares into swords. A plowshare is a metal portion that fits over the blade of a wooden plow, usually made of bronze, and it gave structure and strength to the plow itself. All of this remains the same. The animals were sheltered in that first floor. The second floor is where the family lived. Works out real nice, or a little bit better in the wintertime, because you have animal body heat that would rise, and you would not mind the smell. These people are agricultural and pastoral, and they're used to all the smells of animals, and that's not a particular problem. This is what it would look like on the inside. I don't know if you can see it, but there are a number of amphora jars that are along the back wall there inside the building. And the amphora jars are clay jars that are used for liquid and solid material. You might have amphora jars that were full of wheat or full of barley, or you might have them full of wine. But the amphora jars are around for a long period of time. And they're shipped in containers where the jar is dropped down into a hole within a framework, and it is held in that way. And while we were in New Zealand, my landlord was from Holland and was very wealthy. He'd retired to New Zealand, and I went in his house one day, and he had an amphora jar sitting there in the living room that was just, I sort of drooled, you know, boy, that'd be nice to have. But so I've seen those amphora jars, and you can see where the animals are. Drying of flax on the roof would be not unusual for these people. And there's a roller up on the roof that was used because the roof is made out of mud that's hard baked mud from the sunshine, and every time it would rain, they'd have to get up there and roll out the roof, get it all flattened out again. And so there's a roller up there, up in the upper corner of that particular building. This is what the archaeological dig looks like today. You can see some individuals within it, and there's some of the original stones and the original form of that particular building. This is the defenses of that particular city. We know what they look like. And so when you're looking at ancient society, you're looking at that which is nomadic, that's which would be pastoral, moving around with flocks, or you would be agricultural. You remain in one place and cultivate the land. When we're looking at Ruth and Naomi, you remember they go back to Bethlehem. Boaz is there. Boaz lives in Bethlehem, but he farms, or he farms. Remember, there's a wheat crop and a barley crop. It's all harvested. He's really agricultural, but there are still people that are traveling around in tents who are pastoral. So Abram, when he leaves Ur of the Chaldees, which is very cosmopolitan of the time, a very cosmopolitan city of the time, he goes from an agricultural background to a pastoral background. And that'd be pretty hard. You can always go up society-wise, but going down is really tough. And he went down, but he never issues a word about it. And then the industrial modern, which is centralized into large population areas driven by the use of technology to enable mass production. We find the progress of society, and here we have nomadic, moving from area to area with flocks and herds. Abram in Genesis 11, verse 31 through 12:5. Living in Ur of the Chaldees, that, by the way, is at the southernmost extremity of the Tigris-Euphrates rivers in the Mesopotamian area. And it is as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers today flow into the Persian Gulf. And right down there in that, virtually that delta region, which would make it very high in clay content. That's why the Babylonians, their main building material is glazed, kiln-fired bricks, beautiful bricks. And we'll note that. We'll get into a little bit of the Babylonians and the Assyrians as we move along. But this gives you a little bit of an idea as to what that cosmopolitan city of Ur of the Chaldees would be like. And he's moving from Ur of the Chaldees to a new land as a nomad. Hebrews 11, verses 8 through 10. And he's moving from an agricultural society into one that would be nomadic. Is there any difficulty in that transition? And the answer is, what did God do for us? Philippians 2, verses 5 through 8. Jesus came down, left the Greek word is morphe, the very form of God, and became the form of a morphe of a doulos, a bond servant. So there's going from one culture to another culture in what Jesus has done for us. And we've just about run out of time, but I thought I'd leave some time open for questions if any of you have any questions about all of that, and hope it just didn't go like that. I went kind of fast with it, but I like to get everybody in their mindset with a worldview that takes in what we're studying. And I want you to put yourself, I want you to take your bedroom slippers off and put your sandals on, because we're going to want to walk in the dust of God's people. And that's what we're going to do as we study these sections out of the major prophets. But did anybody have any questions or any thoughts? No questions. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here this evening, and appreciate your attendance. And hopefully get to see you next Wednesday night right here again. Same place.